Hi Fools, welcome to Biotech Banter. I'm Max Macaluso, and joining me today is Fool.com contributor Brian Arelli. Hi Brian.
Hi Max.
So Brian, we have a pretty full show as usual. Let's start with a company that's still very hotly debated among biotech investors, and that's MannKind. You recently had an article for us, and you had a poll that asked readers what they thought about MannKind's upcoming PDUFA date. Can you shed some light on this?
Yeah, so they just had their advisory committee meeting on April 1st, and then they were due to get an FDA decision on April 15th. So that only leaves about 2 weeks. And so I asked investors whether they thought that the FDA would approve it on or before April 15th, or whether there'd be a short delay or a longer 3-month delay, or whether it would never get approved. And more than half of the readers said it would get approved by April 15th. And then this morning we just saw the company announce that they were going to have that the FDA had issued a 3-month delay.
Right. So I guess I have two questions now. The first is, what do you think about the process of having polls on articles, and why MannKind had this delay?
Yeah, so I'm not really surprised about the delay because there's only 2 weeks, right? So it's not really that surprising that the FDA would take some time to incorporate the adcoms, the people on the adcom, make comments, and so they got to incorporate that into the label, and then the company will probably have to do post-marketing studies, and they have to work those details out with the company. So it's not surprising that they would take 3 months to fix, to make a decision. In terms of the poll, it's not really surprising that a majority of the people reading the thing thought there wouldn't be a delay because they're shareholders and they're excited, and they wouldn't be owning the company if they didn't think it would go up. So I think if you polled the general biotech audience, you'd probably get a completely different view of whether there was going to be delay. I think a majority of the people who know a lot about biotech, thought there would be a delay. But I think that a lot of those people aren't going to invest in the company, and therefore they're not really necessarily going to read the article. Some of them might have been short, and they would probably read the article. But I think there's a lot of people who just pass on companies that aren't good, that they don't necessarily want to short it. Because if you short MannKind and it did get approved, it's going to go, it's going to go up substantially, and you're going to lose your short. So I think a lot of people don't want to short companies that they necessarily don't think are good investments.
Right.
So they're not going to read they're not necessarily going to read our articles if they're not investors and they're not short.
Let's take a step back, Brian, and look at the clinical trial results for Afrezza. You brought up something interesting about the conversion issue between how many units of insulin translates to 1 dose of Afrezza.
Yeah, so in the clinical trial, they used a 4-to-1 conversion, and this is important for type 1 diabetics that are currently using mealtime insulin, injected mealtime insulin, and then they have to convert over to inhaled insulin. And so I think that, and then in the advisory committee documents, the FDA said, well, they actually want to use a 3-to-1 ratio. And the FDA does not like you changing things between your clinical trials and what you want to put on the label. And so that certainly is one of the factors that's contributing to the delay in the FDA making a decision. They're going to have to work that out between the company and the FDA, and it may mean that they just revert back to the 4-to-1, and it may mean that that MannKind has to run new trials to get approved in type 1 diabetics.
Let's also talk a little bit about safety. I know that the FDA has been kind of hard on insulins lately, if you look at Tresiba as an example, and it's also very cautious with inhaled drugs. So what are your thoughts on the safety of the product?
Yeah, that was certainly the biggest risk going into the advisory committee meeting, because we only saw the top line results and we didn't have individual patient safety data. And so it was a big risk, and there was really nothing that stood out as being horrible that would make it so that Afrezza couldn't get approved. But I think that it's certainly still a concern of the FDA, and hopefully they can get any of the safety issues worked out in post-marketing trials. They'll have a registry for people that are getting lung cancer, And then, they might have to do a longer study where they measure the people's ability, the lung function. They do a test where you blow into a little tube and it measures your lung function. So they might have to enroll people in a trial and do that over a longer period of time. But I mean, I'm hoping with such a strong advisory committee meeting results, it's the outside doctors, and they overwhelmingly voted to recommend approval. The FDA has the final decision, but I certainly hope that the FDA will follow its panel's recommendation, because otherwise, what's the point of having the panel? I mean, of course, there is precedent for strong panel recommendations and then a drug's not getting approved. Merck has a drug, and it had a unanimous approval or unanimous recommendation, and then the FDA didn't approve the drug.
Right. Well, Brian, to close out this segment, I'm going to ask a simple question that probably doesn't have a simple answer, but let's assume that Afrezza does get FDA approval. What are the chances that MannKind gets a partner, and what are your thoughts on a potential commercial launch for the product? It's been kind of a controversial topic.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know. I mean, I think if somebody, certainly partners seem to be waiting until it gets approved. I think if it gets approved, they can probably find somebody to step up. I think probably it'll be backloaded where, they don't give them very much up front. And most of the incentives are based on sales milestones, and that'll lower the risk for the partner that signs up to market the drug.
Right. Yeah, I think you're correct to be cautious here. And of course, the first catalyst will be FDA approval, and that's really what investors should be focusing on. Again, the new PDUFA date, July 15th. So that's what we'll be watching here. We'll be covering the story when that happens as well. Okay, we have some news from a big biotech company, that's Amgen, and its drug T-VEC. Now, the claim to fame here is that this is a modified herpes virus being developed for the treatment of melanoma. Brian, can you run through the clinical results?
Yeah, so they're testing the drug in melanoma, which is skin cancer, and the first thing they looked at was a durable response rate, and they showed that it extended the durable response rate. But then last week they presented data on overall survival, and it wasn't statistically significant. So we usually set the p-value for statistical significance at 0.05. And their trial showed a difference, but the difference, the statistical significance of the difference was 0.051. So that means there's a 5.1% chance that the difference between T-VEC and placebo was due to chance alone, and the FDA likes to see that below 5%.
Right. So Brian, what are your thoughts on the potential for FDA approval here?
Yeah, I mean, it's sort of an arbitrary number, right? So why is 4.9% chance of it being happened by chance alone okay, but 5.1% isn't? I think, and then the other issue is that, so the response rate was the primary endpoint, and the overall survival was the secondary endpoint. And in general, you can pass your primary endpoint and fail your secondary endpoints and still get approved for the primary endpoint, and the label will say, they approved, it's approved based on this response rate, and overall survival hasn't been shown yet. So I think there's a possibility that it could get approved based on the primary endpoint, but it's definitely an interesting case to watch.
So as investors, we have to go through a few different scenarios when we're looking at a potential investment. So in this case, let's assume that the drug does get FDA approval. What does the competitive landscape look like?
Yeah, and so this is why it might be a big problem that they don't have overall survival, because Yervoy was approved maybe a couple of years ago to treat melanoma, and it does show a 4-month survival advantage. And so it's hard to see it getting prescribed over Yervoy when Yervoy has that that statistically significant survival advantage, and Amgen's T-VEC has a survival advantage, but it's not necessarily statistically significant.
Well, we often see companies try to combine their therapeutics with other drugs currently on the market. Is there any potential here for T-VEC? Yeah,
so they're testing it with Yervoy, and they're also testing it with Merck's one antibody. And so I think, it might show an effect there where it doesn't show an effect in the, where, it wasn't statistically significant. It may also just be that they need, slightly larger clinical trials, and they'll have learned from their mistakes here. And I mean, if you have twice as many patients with the same different median difference, the p-value will go down, and so then that would make it statistically significant. Right. And I think commercially, I think that's the way that it may get approved based on the initial monotherapy, but it's really probably going to get used as a combination product, and that would actually be to Amgen's advantage, right? Because they could get approved as a monotherapy and it'll have minimal sales, but as soon as the data comes out, like in combination with Yervoy, then doctors could start prescribing it in combination with Yervoy in advance, off-label, in advance of when the FDA was going to, the FDA approved it for the combination therapy.
Right, Brian, let's move on to another topic. This is something that was inspired by something you saw on Twitter, and it has to do with share price and the valuation of companies. Now, often share price doesn't really mean anything in terms of the valuation because we have to look at shares outstanding. So what happened on Twitter that made you think about this topic, and why do you think that share price is meaningless to some extent?
Yeah, I mean, so, it's meaningless if you're comparing two companies, right? Because, they have different numbers of shares outstanding. So a $50 share in one company and a $25 share in another company means absolutely nothing because of the number of shares outstanding. But if you look at within a company, especially in biotech, you can't compare the historical prices of the shares because biotechs are continuing to sell more shares. So someone on Twitter pointed out that the MannKind's price after its AdCom share price was lower than its 52-week high, and so I thought, oh, that's kind of weird. But then I went and looked at the market cap, and the market cap is actually higher, and the reason for that is because it sold shares through an ATM at the market offering, and so they have more shares outstanding. So share price times your shares outstanding is your market cap, and so their market cap is higher.
Right, and that's not the only small biotech company that you saw this happen to, right?
No, I think we have a couple of charts on this. Galena Biopharma, again, sold shares, so its market cap is much higher than its, if you normalize to one a year, these are all year charts. If you normalize to a year ago, the market cap is much higher than the share price, and this is just companies losing, investors losing value. So their share price isn't going as high because they're selling shares. And then we have Sangamo Biosciences. They're working on HIV drug again, sold shares, so their market cap is much higher than their share price when you normalize. And then ANI Pharmaceuticals, it went up a lot, but it could have gone up even more if they hadn't sold shares. The investors are valuing it higher in terms of its valuation, its market cap, than they are in terms of its share price, and that's just because they sold more shares.
Right. Okay, Brian, let's move on to our favorite segment, Tweet of the Week. So our tweet comes from Luke Timmerman, and Luke tweeted a quote from Stéphane Bonkel, the CEO of Moderna Therapeutics. He said, "We at Moderna Therapeutics love being private. We only say what we want to the public when we want to say it." And this is from a recent conference. Brian, what are your thoughts on private companies versus public companies?
Yeah, so investors obviously can't invest in private companies, at least unless you're rich and have, millions of dollars to give them. But that doesn't mean that investors should necessarily ignore private companies because they may be investing in public companies that have competitors that are private. And the problem with private companies, as the CEO points out, is that they don't have to disclose as much as public companies, and that can be troublesome for investors in the competitors of the private companies.
Right, we were talking about this topic before the show, and two companies come to mind, right? There's Boehringer Ingelheim, which is based in Germany, and also Zafgan, which is working on some obesity drugs.
Yeah, so BI has a IPF drug and that'll compete with Intermune's Espriet. And so they're gonna release data at a conference coming up in May. But investors aren't going to get any sort of information. I think they released an abstract ahead of the meeting, but we won't get the full data until the actual meeting. And there's nothing really Intermune's investors can do. And then Zafgen is working on an obesity drug, and that'll obviously affect Arena and Vivus and Orexogen. And again, they can be selective. Zafgen has actually released more data than they certainly had to, and I don't really know why they would do that. I mean, I would certainly keep it as private as I could.
Right. Well, actually, that's an advantage that some larger companies have, right? Like big pharmas.
Yeah. So big pharmas don't necessarily have to release data either, and the reason why they don't have to do that is because the data may not necessarily be material to their valuation, right? So smaller companies, if they've only got one or two drugs, they have to release top-line data from clinical trials because it affects the valuation. But a smaller company can hold that data to meetings. AACR is going on this weekend, and Pfizer has a cancer drug, and they held the data. They said that the trial had passed, but they didn't give any more information than that in the initial press release a few months ago, and then just on Sunday they presented the full data.
Okay, and now for a Biotech of the Week. Brian, the AACR meeting is in full swing. It's being held in your neck of the woods, and this week it looks like Agios has some great news there. Shares are up around 25% today. What does Agios do? What caused the pop today?
Yeah, so I mean, honestly, I hadn't looked much into this company. I think it just went IPO. It IPO'd last year, and the shares have been kind of up and down. But it had a huge pop today, and that was based on the data for its AG221, and there were 7 evaluatable patients, and 6 of them had a response. Small phase 1 clinical trial, but I mean, 6 out of 7 is pretty darn good.
And whenever we're looking at small biotechs that pop, it's easy to get excited about one potential drug that can reach the market, but we always look at the pipeline. So what does Agios' pipeline look like?
Yeah, so they have a couple of other drugs, but they're even earlier stage, and they're licensed to Celgene. So I think that's a definite advantage for investors. I mean, if Celgene's obviously going to have seen a lot more data than has been released to the public, and so I think that's a good, a lot of preclinical stuff, and so I think that's definitely an advantage to investors that a large biotech is behind them.
Right, that's something I definitely always like to see. One last thing, Brian, valuation, right? So we're long-term investors here. We like to buy and hold almost forever, but that doesn't mean we can't get in at a good price. So it's very hard to value biotechs, but what are your thoughts on Agios' valuation today?
Yeah, so they're testing it in late-stage AML, so after patients have failed multiple drugs, and so I think that market's probably somewhat small, and I don't think that it justifies their stock price right now. But I think that they're expecting it to work in other blood cancers, and that will justify the price. I mean, I think we're a ways away, right? Because it's phase 1 data, but you could certainly see Celgene eventually buying the company.
Well, we have to see whether or not that will happen. But thanks a lot for your analysis, Brian. And if you're interested in more biotech news and analysis, be sure to check back to Biotech Banter at Fool.com.